Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Performing Arts Global Exchange Cultural Safety webinar. This is the second of the series. And the title of this offering is Supporting Indigenous Artists. Hello, everyone. I see some people piping up in the chat. It is lovely to see so many people signed up for this offering. To understand that it would also be recorded and offered to people who cannot make it. By way of doing the introductions, I'm going to hand it off to my co-presenter, Alethea, for her introduction.
Good morning, everyone. Good to be back and welcome to everyone who might be joining this time. My name is Alethea Beetson. I'm a Kabi Kabi and Wiradjuri woman living on Turrbal Jagera Yagara country here in Meanjin in so-called Brisbane in so-called Australia. I am a theatre maker and a performing arts and music producer, and it's excited to be here with you all today and with the other panelists. I will hand over to Ata to introduce herself and then throw back to Andre.
Morena, tēnā tātou, tēnā koutou, kua hono mai ki tēnei wānanga a ipurangi nei, e kōrero ana mō ngā tāngata take, ngā ringa toi take, ngā kaiwhakaari take. Nō reira, ko Ataahua Papa tēnei, o te ahurei toi o tāmaki ki Aotearoa, engari kai ahi te reiria ahau i tēnei wā, nō reira tēnei ka mihi atu. My name's Ata, and it's my pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me in to have a kōrero about Māori arts and Māori artists, and looking forward to spending the next hour or so with you, all of you, listening to the kōrero, and so tēnā koutou katoa. Over to Andre.
Finding my unmute button. My name is Andre Bouchard, and I am the founder and executive creative producer of Indigenous Performance Productions. My heritage is Kootenai, Flathead Salish, Pend d'Oreille, also known as Kalispel, and Salter Ojibwe. I am currently on the lands of the Puyallup people in Tacoma, Washington, and my pronouns are he, him. And we are all excited to get into this. So last time, and I'm going to do a bit of a recap of the first session, I would also encourage everyone, if you have not we're not able to attend that, to go and look it up and take a look at it. A lot of good information and a lot of good questions were asked in that last session. So last session, we talked about the importance of introductions and talked about what high context versus low context introductions are. High context introductions generally have more about your family, your culture, your people, the geographic area you come from, your role in your community, and that sort of thing. High context introductions can take minutes and minutes and minutes. And by making time for these things, you sort of set the context for what you are doing. So the cultural value of introduction is also something we really delved a lot into, and that every room that you're in, be it virtual or IRL, as it were, you find a context that a framework by which people start comporting themselves. And by decolonizing or using ideas of decolonization, you can make it far more comfortable for intercultural communities to sort of coexist and that sort of thing. Slowing down the expected time, giving people more time to interact and that sort of thing. We also went into the idea of allies and accomplices. Allies, a non-optical ally who's someone who, in essence, puts their money where their mouth is, actually does things rather than just saying things. Many organizations, many individuals say all the right things, but in the end, it ends up being just talk. And I see many people who have spoken up in the chat who are certainly exceptions to this rule. An accomplice is someone who uses their position of power to foment change. And that's sort of the step beyond being an ally. We talked about the ephemeral nature of language, about how language can change from one moment to another, one moment in time to another, and that how the language for one moment in time might not be appropriate for another moment of time, and how to use language with intention, thinking about what you say, unpacking how to say things better in really any given moment. We also published a style guide, a 4-page style guide, and linked to many references. Thank you, Andrew, for putting that in the chat. There is a link to the style guide that Alethea and I created. And we briefly covered a topic that I will go into more later this session, community outreach as protocol. And there was some suggested readings. We have actually more suggested readings in this offering as well. A quick note about questions. Sorry, Ata. You please feel free to enter questions into the chat. We will be monitoring the chat, and if a relevant question or timely question comes up, we will answer it in a moment, but we will make sure to answer all questions before the session has ended. Sorry about that. Ada?
O tēnā tātou, and good morning from Melbourne, Australia. Well, actually Geelong, Australia, but I'm originally from Aotearoa, Ngāti Koroki Kahukura, Ngāti Mahuta, Waikato iwi, from Tainui Waka in the Midwest, in the central to the west coast of the North Island. So yeah, greetings to all of you. So it's my privilege to be, or my pleasure to be here as part of the panel of speakers about with an introduction to Māori culture. And I understand that some of you are bringing a Māori dance group to your spaces, and so that's really exciting for me, having worked many years in that field in the United States as a booking agent for a Māori dance company. So it's really cool. We can just go back one slide, please. Thanks. So I put together a little bit of a list of, as part of an introduction, and it's probably not in the right place, but anyway, of cultural protocols for visiting Māori artists. And so this is absolutely not the be all and end all, but this is an introduction to what we should and shouldn't do when we have Māori visitors. So you can all read that there, but yeah, the biggest thing is to shake hands and press noses to say hello. And this is called the hongi, where we share the breath of life. And it's the best way that you can get together with a person as part of our rituals of encounter. And you'll see a little bit more. There's a photo of a hongi actually being done a bit later on in the presentation. So, and then just some do's and don'ts. But I understand this is going to be sent out to the participants. Is that right, Andre? The presentation here is going to be sent out?
Yes,
yeah?
Yes.
Okay, cool. So I'm not going to go too much over it. I think they're pretty self-explanatory. The biggest thing is that the head is the most sacred part of of the body. So we don't touch people's heads unless we're invited to do so. Yeah, and I think that's pretty standard for lots and lots of cultures anyway, not just Māori, but yeah, just things to be aware of. The other one is the other big one is pronunciation of Māori language is really, really important when you're working with Māori artists. As soon as you try to pronounce the name of a group properly or somebody's name properly, then the level of their engagement with you rises significantly. So if they can tell that you're just really, don't really give a beep, 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 then the attitude may change a little bit as well. So, that's a good way to get Māori artists on side, is to actually make the effort to learn the correct pronunciation of their names. And so I've got a bit of pronunciation exercise further on in the presentation. Okay, can we go to the next one, please? Oh, we'll carry on. That's just my cover page, and I like that photo. So yeah. So where is New Zealand? There you go. Most of us hopefully know where it is. You will be surprised at the number of people in the United States and Canada who do not know where New Zealand is. Some think we're part of Australia. Some think we're part of Africa. And then I've had people ask me what part of the United Kingdom is New Zealand in. So it gives you an idea of where we are geographically, southwest of Australia, and about a 12-hour plane ride from Los Angeles or San Francisco. 15 hours, apparently 15 and a half hours direct from Auckland, New Zealand to New York City. So there you go. Okay, next, please. This gives you an idea of where we are in terms of Polynesia. So we are the southern tip of the Polynesian Triangle, Hawaii being the northern and Rapa Nui or Easter Island being the eastern. And so all of the islands in between make up Polynesia. Polynesia, that Greek word that was coined by that man, James Cook, when he arrived in 1769 to tell people who we are and where we are. Thank you. Next slide, please. So how did Māori get to Aotearoa? By waka or sailing craft that looks similar to these ones pictured. Many people think for some reason that our ancestors got lost and just happened upon Aotearoa, but that is not the case. Over many hundreds of years, we had sailing experts who traveled all around the Pacific Ocean using traditional navigation techniques. In waka haurua or double hulled waka, with these sails, these are a bit more modern now. They've got actual ropes, whereas our ancestors used the materials from the islands to make the ropes for the waka. And for those of our friends in Hawaii, you may be very aware of the workings of the Polynesian Navigation Society and the Waka Hokulea and Hiki Analea, which have both travelled to Aotearoa many, many times. And just recently, just a couple of weeks ago, we had a festival to celebrate this form of navigation, this form of travel. And that was because the art of all of this sailing was nearly died out in Polynesia, because once we got to the islands that we got to, nobody needed to travel to all of the other islands. So it has had a major resurgence, and especially in 2016 with the Hokulea waka sailing around the world. It was the first time a waka haurua of this sort had been outside of the Pacific Ocean. So that was a mean feat in itself. So so this is how Māori got to Aotearoa, and how they traveled around the Pacific Ocean. Okay, next please. Navigation using natural elements, like I've said. So the star culture is very, very important. And we have an affinity with the Indigenous people of Turtle Island, in that many of the tribes from across the United States and Canada are also star people. They have star stories in their background. So it's not just a Polynesian thing. We all look at the stars. Greek and Roman people looked at stars too. So we have our own names for these stars, and our ancestors studied them to be able to determine where they were and what time of the year it was in any given space, depending on which stars they were looking at what time or which season they were in. Okay, next please. Okay, and there you go, Aotearoa, with lots of we're a unique country in that we have, I don't know if it's official yet, but our country is lobbying now to have Aotearoa become an official part of the name of the country. So we have a group of people lobbying for this country now to be called Aotearoa New Zealand. But just an introduction to the word Aotearoa, you can see what it means. So we tell people we're from the land of the long white cloud. And there's a breakdown there, Aotearoa. Papa, next please. And this is the story of the North Island of New Zealand. So you can see that that map is upside down, because if you turn it up the right side, that's the way that it was mapped by, I think it was Abel Tasman or James Cook, and they circumnavigated the islands and created this map. But in our stories, it's actually a fish. The North Island of New Zealand is the fish of Maui, Maui being the demigod through all of the Pacific, and we turn it upside down. So Wellington, which if you're here on the country and you say you're south to Wellington, for us actually Wellington is the head of our fish, and the top of the Northland is the tail of the fish. So we're a little bit topsy-turvy, and so it gives a good credibility to the term down under. Okay, next one, please. So you can see there a representation of a stingray. So the story of Maui is that he went fishing with his brothers, and he ended up fishing up a huge fish, a huge stingray, which then became the North Island of New Zealand. So next, please. South Island of New Zealand, Te Waipounamu, is, we call it Te Waipounamu, the waters of the greenstone. And that refers to a certain kind of jade that's found only in one river in the South Island, so the Arahura River. And we in our stories, we call this Te Waka a Maui, or the Maui's canoe that he went fishing from. And at the bottom, you see Stewart Island, we call that Rakiura, and we believe that that is the anchor stone for that fishing vessel. So lots of stories, lots of kōrero about the origins of our whenua, or of our land. Next, please. I've indicated there where my tribes are, Ngāti Koroki Kahukura and Ngāti Mahuta, right in sort of the central. And over to the left of where that red dot, where that red banner is, you can see the word Tainui. So Tainui is the name of the canoe that my ancestors travelled to Aotearoa on. And so they've broken this up in terms of the different canoes that landed in the migration. Thank you. Okay, so 1642. We look at this boat and we think about Abel Tasman, who was a Dutch man, a Dutch navigator, a Dutch explorer, who arrived in this place, and he looked at it and he thought, oh, there's a place in Holland or in the Netherlands called Zealand. This is New Zealand. So those of you who live in the United States will be familiar with New York, New lots of things. New York, but specifically New Amsterdam, which was the name given by the settlers into the New York area, in the 1700s, so actually in the 1400s. So yeah, so this is Abel Tasman arrived, and then who didn't make landfall, but he did give the country the name. So if we move to the next slide. In 1769, English explorer Captain Cook arrives on the Endeavour, and he maps out the coastline of the country and claims it as part of the British Empire. So this changes the country in the way that the Māori way of life forever. Before his arrival, Māori were 100% of the population. In today's census statistics, there's about just over 5 million people, and Māori make up about 15% of that population. So we're a very diverse country in this day and age, and the Indigenous population has dropped considerably in terms of our percentage. Okay, thank you. In 1835, the Declaration of Independence was signed, He Whakaputanga, and there was a little bit of confusion. Māori signed a declaration that was written in Māori, and the governors, quote-unquote governors of the time, signed a declaration that was written in English, and they did not say the same thing. So The Declaration of Independence was signed by about 35, maybe 40 chiefs, mostly from the northern part of Aotearoa. And they saw it as a way to ward off the challenges faced through European contact. The theory of France had intimated that he wanted to take over part of the North Island and create a French state. And the English were like, oh, no, that's not happening. Let's make a treaty, or let's have an agreement with the Indigenous people, and we'll make it a part of England, and then we'll ward off that French onslaught. And so from 1835, that takes us to the next slide. In 1840, another declaration was signed between Māori and the British government, and that was the Treaty of Waitangi. And they call it Treaty of Waitangi because that was where it was signed, at a place called Waitangi in the North Island of Aotearoa. And the treaty was signed by, was a treaty between Māori and the Crown, the British Crown. The treaty guaranteed, quote unquote, guaranteed that Māori would retain sovereignty while the English would take over the governance. However, the English version of that treaty was that England would take over everything and the Māori would look after their own fishing and hunting, but that didn't quite happen. So that's still something that's under contention today. Lots of people fighting about or arguing over which version of the treaty was actually the correct one. Thank you. Okay, so let's go to Aotearoa now. We're talking about traditional gathering spaces. So here you can see a photograph of a typical meeting house, a typical wharenui on a marae. Our marae are our gathering spaces where our traditional ceremonies and rituals are still carried out. And we go back there all the time. I'm very, very involved in our marae. This is actually a photo of my marae in Waikato. And so a marae traditionally has a sleeping house or a meeting house where everybody puts mattresses on the floor and sleeps under the same space, much like a longhouse in North America. It has a large dining room because part of the cultural responsibilities is hospitality and making sure that our visitors are fed well and looked after under what we call manaakitanga, and with an ablution block, and then toilets and showers, and there's sometimes other buildings on a marae, but those are the three main ones that you will find in most marae. We come together for all events, birthdays, weddings, funerals, and they're all conducted in our traditional way, so using our reo, our language, and keeping the rituals the same. So yeah, they take place on the grounds of that marae. Thank you. Next one, please. Traditional houses of learning were employed by our people when they lived in the villages. And so these are just examples. I've just put these illustrations up there, but wharepura, you see on the left there is a flax bush. Wharepura was the house of weaving, where they would dedicate children to the art of weaving clothes. They would weave baskets, decorative panels for our ceremonial houses, and strings for dance implements. So if you're familiar with poi, poi in Aotearoa are balls on strings that are swung around as percussion. A little bit different in Hawaii. In Hawaii, they pound the poi to make a paste and then they eat it. So it's a little bit, I think the name poi actually comes from the shape of the bulb of that plant. So, and in the middle we have an instrument, a bullroarer or pūrerehua, to represent our whare tapere, our house of entertainment. And so because we're bringing artists to North America, it's it's really good for us to learn a little bit whare tapere about the story of Kai and Tinido. And Tutunui was a whale. Kai, the whale was linked to a person and to take him home. This is my shortened, abridged version of the story. And so Tutunui was linked to a chief to take him home as a mode of transport. Our people in our stories rode whales. And then when the whale got to where the chief was going to, he was supposed to have been let go to return home, but that chief actually killed the whale and ate him. And when the owner of the whale found out, he sent a group of women to the village to find out who it was that had killed his pet whale. And so the woman, the chief who had killed the whale had a very noticeable pattern on his teeth. And so the woman's job was to make sure that the chief who killed the whale smiled so that they would be able to see his teeth and be able to correctly identify. And so they did that through entertainment with songs and dances, and they became raunchier and raunchier until the chief actually had let out a big laugh, and they were able to see his teeth, and then the death of the whale was avenged. So that's our story for the traditional beginnings of our whare tapere, or our house of entertainment. And so under that house now comes all of what we call entertainment in terms of arts, any artistic endeavours, especially music and dance and theatre. And then the last one is whare wānanga, whare tūtaua, the house of weaponry. And so you see there a weapon there. It's a model of a taiaha, which you may see, handheld staff rather than a spear. It's a weapon that handheld, hand-to-hand combat, which Māori became very, very good at. Next, please. So rituals of encounter. So whai kōrero is the world of Māori oratory. It's it's very much practiced today, and so that in every marae that you go to, there will be a whai kōrero from one of the male members of that whānau. They'll stand up and in our traditional way of acknowledging all of those who have passed before us, acknowledging any atua or deities, some Christians, some not. And if you're from my tribe, then you will acknowledge that we have a Māori king, and it's an organisation or a movement that was established in the 1860s to try and combat the loss of land through confiscation. So that's whai kōrero. And they're always supported by a song. So whai kōrero and oratory is an art form in itself, and it's not practiced by everybody. You have to be a trained person to be able to get up and do a whai kōrero, and then your family will stand up to sing a waiata tautoko, or a song of support. Next, please. So as I was talking about hongi, so the hongi is the pressing of nose and the foreheads together. Some people keep their eyes open so that they are looking directly into the eyes of the person that they hongi with. Most people close them. And there are a couple of ways to hongi. So here you can see that this gentleman and I are doing our hongi, pressing nose and forehead together and holding on for a few seconds. Other tribes around different parts of, from different parts of the country will do 2 short bursts of nose pressing and then step back and shake hands. So it really is a tribal. I don't know what the English word is, but yeah, it's a he momo iwi. So it's a ritual, the component of the ritual. Okay, so that's the hongi. So that's how you may want to greet any Māori artists that come to your space. It's a very personal way of greeting people.
So we had a quick question in the chat of how the hongi gets impacted during the pandemic.
During the pandemic, we actually did away with hongi because it was so close. And so what we would do is, instead of doing hongi during the pandemic at any meetings where we were able to gather, and still now we don't necessarily hongi all the time. So what we'll do is fist bump. Some do the elbow greeting where they elbow to elbow, and some will just, instead of doing anything that requires any physical contact, will stand and do a karakia, or an incantation to clear the way of any spirits or anything between them, which is what the hongi necessarily does anyway. Ka pai. Okay, so we talk about identity, and when Māori introduce ourselves, we always talk about our canoe, our mountain, our river, maybe our marae, and maybe a dominant ancestor or a well-known ancestor from our tribes. And because on the understanding that we're sort of down at the bottom of the food chain in terms of where we are, with that humility. So we always talk about ko tai nui te waka, ko maunga tautari te maunga, ko Waikato te awa. The ancestral canoe that my tupuna or my ancestors travelled to Aotearoa on was a Tainui canoe. The mountain that is in my part of the country that you might be familiar with is Mangatautari, and the river that flows through my area that I grew up in is Waikato. Some people will acknowledge the beach or the ocean that is close to where they live. Not everyone is the same. We all have tribes, we have sub-tribes. And so it's a good way of people being able to connect without you actually saying your name. And in this day and age, many of our names are different. Some have married and they've married people from other cultures, and so the names are not Māori. So this is a good way for you to, at a gathering of Māori people, for you to connect yourself to the land. And that's important as well, because Māori have a very strong connection to our whenua, to the land that we grew up in, and to the landmarks of our area. We have lots of sayings and we have lots of proverbs that tell us to return to your mountains so that the winds of Tawhiri Mātia, the god of the winds, can blow, can purify your thoughts, and the rains from Ranginui will be, you'll be rained on, and that will cleanse you. So yeah, there's lots of sayings and lots of kōrero about that. Thank you. Okay, so Māori history, Māori oral history. We weren't our culture was not a written, our form of communication was not a written form. It was sitting by the fire mostly, or sitting around and telling stories and composing songs to mark significant happenings, and to teach those songs and those stories to the next generation of storytellers, to the next generation of people. And so kōrero āwaha or Māori oral history traditions are very, very important. These are, you can see here, there's two images to tell the same story used in modern ways. So the image on the left there is an image of Ranginui Papa Tuanuku. So that's our creation story of Sky Father, Earth Mother, who that story tells us we're joined together in darkness and had many, many children, all of whom became gods. But because they were joined together and it was darkness, the children decided that they wanted to separate the parents to create a world of light. And so in the image on the right, you can see a postage stamp that tells the story of the separation of Rangi and Papa, Ranginui and Papa Tuanuku, by one of their sons, Ngāti Mahuta. And the story is that he lay on his back and he pushed up, and he pushed his father up into the heavens while laying on his back on his mother. And so that is our creation story of how sort of atua and how everything happened. And then from there, humans were formed, and then the world as we know it sort of became. So there's the very beginning of nothing, where sounds and whispers started to appear before the atua, or Ranginui and Papa Tuanuku, gave birth to all of these deities or these children. Thank you. Okay, so basic Te Reo Māori language lesson. A, e, I, o, u. A, e, I, o, u. And if you can see that the vowel at the second set of vowels has a macron, that's called tohuto. And the significance of that macron above a vowel is that it lengthens the pronunciation. So with that one is Ataahua, Peke, Whira, Hōtera, Putu. A, e, I, o, u. Whereas the shorter versions are A, E, I, O, U. And the lengthening of a vowel can significantly change the meaning of a word. And I use an example of keke and keke. So keke is cake and keke is armpit. So we never ever want to offer anybody a slice of armpit with their cup of tea. So that's a very important thing to note in the pronunciation of te reo. Thank you. And on the next slide, we've got some words that you might come across as part of your engagement with the dance company that I understand is traveling from Aotearoa. So Aotearoa. So what you can see there is actually our syllables in our language are all broken up with vowels. So wherever there's a vowel, usually wherever there's a vowel, that's the end of a syllable. And the best way to pronounce Aotearoa, we run them together. Aotearoa, Aotearoa, Aotearoa. It reminds me of the electric company back in the days with the cat. So the same sort of context applies here. Aotearoa. The next one is atamira, 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 atamira. No vowels in any of those words. So that tells us that it's not atamira, it's atamira. Whare tapere, whare tapere. So these are exercises that you could do on your own using that pronunciation guide. Couple of anomalies, I guess, in the Māori language is that we have two what we call digraphs. So the WH is pronounced as F, and the NG is pronounced as Ng. F and Ng. So whare tapere and Ng ngaho. So you think about the word sing a song. So that soft G with the Ng sound is the pronunciation of that digraph. Ngaho, ngaho, ngaho. You can see the next word down there has a macron, has a tohuto above the first A. So we know that that is not fa, that's fa. Fa na u, fa no, fa no. Fa no meaning family. Ngaho means to entertain. Whare tapere is our house of entertainment. Atamira is the name of the company. That's one of the companies that's traveling from Aotearoa, New Zealand. And in the last word we have iwi, and iwi means bones. So our iwi are our bones or our tribe or our people. So you quite often you hear it used as a reference to people. Thank you. So ngā mahi a rehi, a couple of photos of what traditional Māori performing arts look like. People standing in ranks with poi, wearing the same uniform and doing actions to songs, so using hand actions to portray words. The bottom one is a group of from a national competition that we have here in Aotearoa that will be in February, the last weekend of February. Every 2 years we have a national Māori performing arts competition called Te Matatini, and this year I think there are 48 groups, all of whom they're limited to 40 people on the stage. Otherwise that would be a huge stage that we have to build. It's a huge stage anyway. 40 people on a stage performing for no more than 30 minutes every 2 years, but it's very big, and it involves so many people around Aotearoa in this kapahaka is what we call it, the kapahaka performing arts. Thank you. Some of the clothes that you'll see traditional Māori performing artists wear were woven from, so the bodice on the top, or the pari, is using contemporary materials, wool on a almost like a needlepoint backing, but the designs all represent stories from the group that they come from. The one in the middle is called a piu-piu, and that's woven from harakeke. So if we remember back to our houses of learning, the whare tapere, the whare pora was the house of weaving, and they would make what these skirts we call piu-piu, most commonly called grass skirts, and I know that our Hawaiian whānau will relate to things being called grass skirts, but our piu-piu are very difficult to make, and it still takes about 6 to 8 weeks to make one skirt, and they're still made in a traditional way. So harvesting harakeke or flax, there's no machines used, it's all done by hand. The patterns there, the harakeke is hard, and the pattern is formed by the use of a mussel shell that's not harvested, so mussels that are brought from the ocean that grow naturally. The sharp edge of a mussel shell is then used to scrape off the outside hard covering, which leaves a soft inner fibre, which is then boiled and then soaked in black mud or paru to make those designs that you see there. So it has become quite the science. We now use some modern materials, some modern tools to make the piu-piu in terms of knives to score the hard surface of the harakeke, but it still means that you have to have hands on you have to get your hands in there holding the flax and the mussel shell to scrape the covering, and the soft fibres at the top there to make the string, and it's rolled by the weaver, rolling it up against her leg. So it really is a specialised skill. And so these skirts are quite, you'll see that most groups in the National Performing Arts will wear these pipi. And in the bottom right hand corner we have a korowai, or a cloak, which is made from all of the soft natural fibres of the harakeke. And so to make that kākahu, you have to scrape off all of the hard shell of the flax or the harakeke to only have the soft fibres. And so it can be very hard on your hands, but weavers love it. And I know many weavers who spend all of their waking hours playing with flax and creating different things out of harakeke and the other resources that we have here. Thank you. And then tūtaua, we talked about the whare tūtaua, the house of weaponry. So these are just examples of some of the weapons that our tupuna or our ancestors used in hand-to-hand combat. Nowadays, you might see them on the stage as a prop for performing arts. So on the left is a kotiate, and the shapes are very determine what they are. So the kotiate with the two notches in the middle. In the middle is a wahaika with the sharp point in the top, and that was actually used to hit somebody on the head as part of the hand-to-hand. Well, all of them were, but this was, so you would have to get very, very close to your opponents to be able to do damage with that weapon. None of our weapons were thrown; they were all very hand-to-hand, used in hand-to-hand combat. And then the taiaha, that's a sort of a taller version of the other model that we had. So the taiaha, again, hand-to-hand combat. And it used as similar to an English quarterstaff, in which it's held in the hand of the warrior and used to impact different parts of the body and weaponry. So you can think about hand-to-hand combat. What's the best thing is to disable your opponent. So many of these were used to crack knee bones, and we'll get away from the gruely stuff. Tūtaua. Okay, next please. And it brings us to Māori, traditional Māori music. And so one of the things is that we didn't have drums. Māori don't have drums in our traditional music, but we do have the poi, which is the ball on the string, as part of our percussion. But we also have these. So many of the hui or the gourd on the left there was used for rattling. The seeds were left in the gourd, or it can be blown like a flute with the hole in the top. And the top of that image is a kōauau, or a carved nose flute, or nowadays a mouth flute as well, a nguru. In the bottom, you can see the shell, putatara. So many Pacific cultures have the conch shell as part of their traditional music makers or their traditional sound makers. And then on the right-hand side is the pūrerehua, or the bull roarer, which is held in the hand and spun. And it makes that sound. So very significant sounds, very different sounds, all as part of traditional Māori musical instruments. Cool. Next, please. And then we talk about carvings or whakairo. So you may see many of the performers wearing carved pendants out of either green stone, which is our form of jade, or bone. Traditionally used whale bone, but nowadays they're carved from beef bone or cow bone, because whales are protected and we can't use those bones anymore. Or sometimes they're made from stone or wood or shell. And so you'll see greenstone, or you'll see paua shell, which is a shell of the abalone. And the bone, you see the combs in the bottom right-hand corner, those are hair combs, all made from bone. So you can see that they're all different colors. Some of them are soaked in liquids for the bone to absorb the color, to make them different colors. Some of them will pick up the natural color of the body oils when they're worn. So over time, they will fade to a sort of a browny, darker yellow color. And if they're brand new, they're very, very, very white, because the bones are bleached before they're used, so before they're carved. And these designs are all typical Māori designs that you'll see. On the left is a manaia which is our word for seahorse. So you can see the story about a manaia is you will always only ever see one side, one eye. It's on its side, so that the other side that you can't see is looking after you. They're all protectors. They're all what we call kaitiaki, and they're warding off anything that might come to you from a spiritual realm, because we're very big believers in spiritual heebie-jeebies coming from the other side. So the tiki in the middle is probably the most common form that you'll see. And the tiki has been used as a symbol of fertilization. And so many people will wear that, but also he's just a bit cute, I think. And so a lot of people wear those tiki. And the bottom, the green stone at the bottom is in the shape of the hook. And that's our reminder of our origins in terms of New Zealand, in terms of the story of Maui and how he fished up the North Island. But it was also maybe given to somebody who is a provider for their family. And because fishing was a way that we did that. So they're all very symbolic. And then the heru or the hair combs, which were worn in the top knots. And most of the men would have long hair and they would put them up in top knots and they would secure them with these heru or these carved combs. And so sometimes you would see warriors wearing 2 or 3, depending on their status in the tribe or their status as a warrior. So just as a point of interest, we talk about the head being the sacred part of the body. So with the combs, we then think, okay, anything to do with the head should not be placed on a table where there's food. So that hair brushes and these hats and hair combs should never ever be placed on a table or a chair. We never wash our hair in a kitchen sink. We don't brush our hair in the kitchen or the dining room. So because at the risk of contamination, I guess, of one part to the other. So we don't want to be that which is sacred with the food being something that breaks tapu or that breaks the sacredness of a gathering, which is why at the end of any traditional Māori gatherings, we always share food, because that is the final part of our rituals of encounter. Okay, next one. All right, and then you'll see you'll see me. I'll just show here that I wear a moko kauai. And everybody that has a moko, and they're not just on the face, we do have many that are that have moko or traditional tattoos that are on different parts of their body, all have a story, and nobody has the same, because nobody's story is the same. Everybody has their own journey in life. And so absolutely, if you see somebody with moko, feel free to ask them the story about it. If they don't want to share it, then just accept that they won't. Some of them are very, very personal. I have no problem sharing the story of my moko, and which is a tribute to my mother who passed away. And on what would have been her 75th birthday, I got my moko to honour her. Traditionally, Māori men had full facial moko, and the women were chins and sometimes the forehead. But now we have warriors who had what we call puhoro, which are from sort of the midriff of the torso down, buttocks and thighs down to their knees. And that is undergoing a huge resurgence as well. And so men and women now are wearing puhoro, which is awesome. And because it's our written form of our story in terms of carving. So our moko were carvings that were etched into the skin of our warriors, of our chiefs, of our people of importance, of people of significance. But nowadays, the only criteria to having a moko is that you're Māori and that you're getting it done for the right reasons. There's no stipulation. Thank you. So that's our traditional introduction to Aotearoa. So this is modern day New Zealand. Any map that you find of New Zealand, it will look like this. 3 islands. We've said Te Ika a Maui, the North Island, Te Waka a Maui, Maui's canoe, the South Island, and then Rakiura, Stewart Island, the anchor stone right at the very bottom there. Of course, we had the James Cook and the Abel Tasman, who gave them the poetic names of the North Island, the South Island, and Stewart Island. in the main city or at the bottom of the North Island, you'll see Wellington, that's our capital. Population, according to the 2021 census, was just over 5.1 million. Yeah, so now the 3 official languages in Aotearoa are English, Māori, and Sign Language, New Zealand Sign Language. Our landmass of our country is equivalent to the state of Colorado. We have there's something about the soil in New Zealand that helps trees to grow. And so, unfortunately, a lot of our native bush was cut down and the land was used to plant pine trees. Apparently, a pine tree can mature from a seedling to a mature tree in about 30 years. And so the tree, sorry, I've just seen the chat pop up. I was like, oh, hey, I haven't even seen that. The pine trees are, you'll see now pine trees that are all over New Zealand. So we're undergoing this a project now where we're trying to replace a lot of those trees and replant the native trees so that our birds, our native birds, will have their traditional foods going forward, berries and the seeds from those traditional plants. Our government in New Zealand today, we're governed by a Prime Minister and Parliament that is based on the British governmental system. The King of England is recognised as the official head of state for that, but Māori will sort of push back against that because we have our own system of chiefs and rangatira. Every tribe had their own chiefs. And so we do have a group of iwi leaders where spokespeople from many of those tribes will come together to debate the issues of the day and to see about how Māori will push back against the government for different kaupapa. It became very prominent during the pandemic where the government was forcing mandates onto the people of our country, and Māori fought back a little bit, pushed back and said, actually, we know how to look after our people. So, yeah. So that's New Zealand in a nutshell. Oh, and that's my I love that image. So I just thought I'd put it in a little stylized Māori Aotearoa image instead of being just New Zealand. So, yeah, that brings us to the end of my short presentation today, but I'm hoping that everybody sort of learnt a little bit more about Aotearoa that you didn't know, and that will give you a point for researching about New Zealand, getting some, if you have specific questions. I don't know if there are questions in the chat. I do see lots of things in the chat there. But happy to answer any questions and hand it back over to Alethea and Andre.
Sorry, was having trouble finding my cursor. Thank you so much, Ata. For that very thorough and lovely presentation. Let's see where we are. So it sort of segueing, hopefully it's not too much of a abrupt, I should say. I was going to start talking about hospitality and gift giving next. So there are many traditions, and when you end up in a sort of a multicultural situation, if there is a formal, there is the possibility of a formal exchange, and if you're, say, like a venue, which most of you are, and you have a Indigenous performing arts group coming in, there might be the request to do a formal ceremony to pay homage, to do things right by the people of the land and that sort of thing. For instance, at the Western Arts Alliance in Vancouver and in Calgary more recently, we had international Indigenous groups, and all of them did their welcome ceremonies or their traditional introductions in turn, as it were. But it doesn't have to, hospitality and gift giving doesn't necessarily have to occur in a formal setting. It always occurs in a formal setting. But if you want to be a good custodian of trust and that sort of thing, you might want to consider looking at obtaining small gifts within the tradition of gift giving as a welcome. So as a performing arts venue, and if you're white folk, that would most likely manifest as probably something that you would identify as merch for your organization. So a t-shirt, a sweatshirt. I'm very fond of looking at the local artisans where I live personally and buying something small from them. For instance, beekeepers or people who make jams or jellies, food items, popcorn, I've seen given and very much appreciated. If the artisans are native or indigenous, or have a particular story behind them, all the better. And being able to give those gifts with the story that it involves as well. And it being an introduction to both the community that you represent, but also perhaps as the community that you are trying to serve as well. So the local indigenous community. Gift giving to me as an indigenous person has always meant that you're really trying to do things the right way, that you're really trying to pay respect to the people that you are trying to welcome, that you've thought of things. And the thoughtfulness really does count in terms of sort of how people will sort of decide whether or not to deepen relationships with you or not. So when in doubt, ask questions. I am available for questions about what might be an appropriate gift or not. I personally, my gift that I give in situations, I give gifts of merch from my company. So for instance, the sweatshirt that I have, or t-shirt, or a pin in that same, if I'm looking for something a little bit bigger. The larger gifts in Native American tribes are traditionally blankets. You see Pendleton or 8th generation or indigenous designed blankets as sort of a larger gift if you want to deepen that. And so yeah, one of the places that I go to is I give white sage from Montana. The state harvested off of the reservation that I grew up on in my ancestral homelands. And so sage being one of several things that people burn to smudge and cleanse themselves, and that's where I go. But that's my social and cultural context. So if you have social and cultural context, again, culture is a big idea. If you are a beekeeper, or if you are a gardener, or if you are that sort of thing, I find the most touching sort of gifts that I've received are gifts that are personally relevant or relevant to your community, or that sort of thing. And generally you keep these things small. So, $30 or under, and that sort of thing. So at the beginning of sort of introductions, as the artist first walks into your venue, is usually the best time. it wouldn't be appropriate if, as part of a multi-day residency, combining the tradition of giving gifts to performers before or after performances to give gifts at that point in time. So instead of flowers on a curtain call and that sort of thing, giving gifts at that point in time, that has felt very appropriate to me as well. So questions in the chat, if there are any. Yes, I think I answered that. So if there's a performance, it could be done after the performance, before the performance, in the green room, if it's something more private that you want to talk with them about, or on the first day. There is some flexibility. If they show up and with a gift as well, the gift giving is usually done at the same time and that sort of thing. So if that answers your questions. Any other questions with regards to this? Do any of the other culture consultant, Ada or Alethea, want to chime in on it? Any of this gift giving?
Yeah, I've just put a note in there that just to remember that if the artists are international artists, so if they're coming from Aotearoa, that food or sage may not be appropriate because they may not be able to take them home. They might be confiscated or, so just to think about that. And for artists that are traveling internationally, smaller is usually better. Big huge things. So if you're with a space that has museums love to give books. Museums and art galleries love to give big, thick, heavy books, and then we're like, oh, thank you. And then it's like, oh, how are we going to get all of these home now? So, it's just adds to the weight of a probably already jam-packed suitcase. So just to think about, little things. And we have a saying in Māori that ahakoa iti he pounamu. So even though it's small, it is treasured. And it's about the thought behind the gift giving rather than the actual item itself. So think about that too with gift giving and that sort of. What we like to do as Māori, we'll welcome people into the space on the very first day that they're packing in. So that may be an appropriate place to do it too as well. So do it privately rather than in front of an audience. But it's whatever works for your space. There is no inopportune time, I think, to give gifts if people are gathering. Because it's about the thought behind it. It really is about the thought that counts.
Exactly. And yeah, anything that you can do to sort of like give context and deepen the relationship is very much appreciated as well. So.
Yep.
So if we're okay, we can move on to the next slide. So connecting with your local Indigenous communities. So I give actually quite a few consultations on this. About how to build things. Since the United States is so big and there are so many different stories with regards to, how Indigenous communities were able to, either remain or take root in certain areas and that sort of thing, or on the other side, maintain a part of or all of their ancestral homelands. You end up with really a patchwork of tribes across the country, tribes that have sort of regional sort of influence and that sort of thing. Urban Native communities. The United States for almost 30 years, in the 1970s, there was something called the American Indian and Vocational Act, which basically scooped up Native people off of reservations and sent them to cities for jobs that didn't exist. And so that was the most recent example of hundreds of years of relocation policy, basically to take the land out from underneath Native and Indigenous tribes and communities and just destroy their systems and that sort of thing. So as a result, 74% of Native American particularly people live outside of their ancestral homelands, or as many people think of, or reservations, as it were, because many reservations aren't ancestral homelands. So if you are lucky enough to have a tribe nearby, then there is frequently a tribal sort of public relations officer, and it's their job to talk to, folk like you. And they're oftentimes very busy and that sort of thing. And so it might take some patience. It might get their attention if you offer to buy them lunch. Go to them and buy them lunch, and that sort of thing as well, because many of these public relations officers are tasked on a state level with being also the liaison for local government, state government, public schools, that sort of thing. Okay, so, but if there isn't a tribe in your area, the next sort of tier of people I advise people to sort of reach out to as sort of a way of initiating contact is, if there's a college or university, there's over 200, last I checked, Native American studies programs across the country. And frequently it is the job of someone at the college or university to also be a public face to the university Indigenous community. So that might also be a friendly face that might be willing to dialogue with you about sort of getting your head around and understanding this. Of course, this is all understanding that the context by which you're reaching out to is you have an understanding, you've done your research and done your best. You've gone onto native land, looked at who the traditional homelands are, and that sort of thing. So there are many different sort of roles that one can have within a culture. You can have more of a corporate role within a tribe as a public relations person. That person may or may not actually be a culture bearer. Culture bearers can be, but are not always elders. They are in certain tribes drum leaders, or have other ceremonial titles and that sort of thing. When getting into a situation in a culture that is not your own, my suggestion is to, of course, do your research, but also slow down and put your observer hat on. Building relationships doesn't happen overnight. It takes months and years. One of the people that I have advised in the past, in Idaho actually, ended up going to tribal meetings for well over 6 months, just sitting in the back and sort of watching the meeting. And eventually, a couple of the tribal leaders came up to him and were like, "Well, we've seen you here, what's your story?" And it turned out to be a very, very positive relationship, because they understood that he was showing up. He was doing his best to understand what was important to them. And, by understanding what they were talking about, he understood what the alignment with the tribe and potentially his organization were. And the relationship, flourished from there. So again, patience, respect. When you're asking for something, usually compensation is in order. Native American people have been asked for free things for a very long time. And I know the same thing goes for many other Indigenous communities around the US. And so putting, putting that sort of that appreciatory token out there is certainly good, called for. So moving on to the next slide. So Native people are not a monolith. And there are also a lot of different ways that you can connect with different parts of the Native community. I know presenter organizations, arts organizations that are doing amazing jobs for the Two-Spirit Indigenous community in the US. And as such, I think I need to hurry up a little bit. You know, and that's great if you are an organization that has a strong queer programming face. Lean into that is my advice, and that sort of thing. I am going to skip over this slide. I have some resources at the end where you can educate yourself around the history of this. I did not realize the time was getting out of hand so badly. Alethea, it's up to you.
I will also whip through this a little bit and try and make sure the resources that get sent through can cover anything that is required. But I just wanted to thank Andre and Ata for sharing knowledges with us all. So very appreciative of the learning that I get to do in these moments, and appreciate the greater understandings of the ways in which we're similar and different, and always love that the differences actually come back to the land, which in a sense is a similarity. I just want to do a warning. I'm about to mention the name of someone who is deceased, and for some Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and perhaps other Indigenous cultures, that is a protocol to give that warning, and also going to mention something that is associated with trauma. It's just really important before I speak publicly about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community and cultural context that I acknowledge the sorry business that is happening across the community right now here in so-called Australia. Sorry business can have different meanings for different cultural groups, but it usually refers to the bereavement and mourning and perhaps ceremony processes that occur when someone has passed on to the ancestors or has passed away. In the context of the sorry business, I'd like to acknowledge is that the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community is in collective mourning. We were holding vigils last night, so all of about 12 hours ago, for a 15-year-old boy who was killed in a racially motivated attack. So it's really important before I speak publicly that I acknowledge that sorry business, and hope that in doing so, have showed a cultural protocol that visiting artists from so-called Australia who are Indigenous to these lands might also need to follow and wish to follow as well. I'm going to briefly talk about community connection being a fundamental part of Production Week. So when, as an artist and as a producer, there is always programmed time for welcoming or community connection wherever that may fit within that particular presenting body or institution. These community welcomes gatherings and meals are part of the Production Week schedule, and they can look very different even on these lands based on how colonisation has impacted the certain region and based on where the particular festival or presenting body is at with their engagement with local Indigenous communities and what structures that they have put in place. And artists and companies from so-called Australia, we have an understanding of the global impacts of colonisation, and we're always really happy to meet presenters and communities wherever they may be on their journey. And this flows on from what Andre was saying around connecting with local communities. These connections are as vital as getting the tech plot right, often from an Aboriginal and also, even though I can't speak on behalf of that, Torres Strait Islander context. So some examples from even just in a so-called Australian context is if we travel to Larrakia country, which is in Darwin Festival, you know, they have a practice there where they welcome Indigenous artists who are visiting from other tribal groups here in so-called Australia, but also from overseas. And they're welcomed by the traditional owners and custodians of the land in a welcoming ceremony. Recently, we opened a play at the Queensland Performing Arts Centre, which is all of about 10 minutes drive from where I am now, as part of Brisbane Festival. And we met with their Indigenous staff and the Indigenous Advisory Group. Sometimes that can also just be another visiting company and coming together so that if we're all in the same building as Indigenous artists, we're connecting and have that relational connection. Often when we're going overseas and visiting other folks' lands, we will seek this out ourselves because it is part of our protocol. Speaking from my own experiences, the way that protocol operates for me and certainly other groups is that we will follow the protocol of the land that we are on. And also build in our own protocols around that. So often that's where gift giving, to tie that in, gift giving, seeking, if presenters have visiting artists from so-called Australia who are Indigenous, and there is gift giving protocol, it's always really great to have context of that in advance so that we can come prepared with what is most appropriate to the lands that we are on. I might just quickly skip to the next slide. Thank you. So just to kind of recap, there are two Indigenous groups, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So Aboriginal people are the mainland and Tasmania, which is down the bottom. And there's a circle at the top there on the east coast, right at the top of so-called Queensland, and that's the Torres Strait Islands, and that's where the Torres Strait Islander people are from. I am Kabi Kabi and Wiradjuri, which is on the middle of the east coast of so-called Australia, and therefore of Aboriginal culture. And that is what I usually can speak to. But I wanted to kind of show this slide. You might hear Indigenous folks refer to Australia. Thank you. Refer to Australia as a continent, and that is all of those different colours on that map, whilst not necessarily accurate because of colonial impact and where these conversations are at. But all of those different colours represent different language groups or different countries or different nations or different tribal groups. And each of those tribal groups have their own language, set of customs, stories, and there might be interconnections, but there's also many, many differences. Australia is a very vast continent, and consequently the land is very different, and that's led to a lot of those differences. The temperature within itself can vary greatly from the tip of Queensland, including the Torres Strait, all the way down to Tasmania, which creates those differences in how we operate seasonally and how we operate from a land-based perspective. But within those different tribal groups, there is also different colonial stories around how colonization has impacted certain tribal groups, but also how colonization has impacted certain individuals as a result of variety of assimilation and genocidal policies, one being possibly more well known, but perhaps not in an overseas context. And that is, for example, the stolen generations, which was the late 1800s for a large part of the 1900s, specific policies around removing Aboriginal and mainland Torres Strait Islander people from their homes as a part of assimilating them into the colonial Australian culture, whilst the stolen generations has been dealt with in colonial government sense. It's important to note that Indigenous children on these lands are being removed at a higher rate than they were then from their families. So a lot of our issues are ongoing, and perhaps there definitely is some similarities with the lands that you are from. And as a result of that, both the context of these many different nations, but also the context of the ongoing impact of colonization, each visiting Indigenous artist group, if they're Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, and really from elsewhere, will require, I suppose, an individualized approach and just having a conversation, if you can, about what their needs might be. I will skip to the next slide. I just was when we were talking about this, Andre had mentioned I didn't really speak to some of the basic indicators, and so these are the two flags for the two Aboriginal groups. The Aboriginal and the Torres Strait Islander, the two Indigenous groups. So the Aboriginal flag on the left there, and the Torres Strait Islander flag. I can speak. I'll send more details about this, but the Aboriginal flag and the Torres Strait Islander flag were both in the 1970s for the Aboriginal flag and 1990s, and have both got significant meaning. You will definitely possibly recognise those within the context of some of the artists that are visiting. I'll just pop to the next slide. So in terms of the cultural context of so-called, I'm actually just go to the next slide. My mouse has stopped working, so I can't see the chat box at the moment to see if there are any questions. So feel free to interrupt me, Andre or Ata. But I wanted to kind of highlight how, as an Indigenous artist and producer, I connect with how I make work or how I create programming. And this is a personal lifelong journey that is constantly interconnected with learnings from my community and learnings from the elders and residents in which I work with, some of which we share the same country connections. So we are from the same kind of language group, and some, you know, I have a Torres Strait Islander elder that I work with regularly, as I am aware that in this so-called Australian context, a lot of the work I do is national and also international, that whilst I cannot speak on behalf of that culture, it is important that I'm advocating and being respectful of that culture. So with regards to connection, there's basically three tenets with three components in each. With regards to connection, country is of significant importance. So where I am, and whose country I am on will determine a lot of the processes in which I am able to follow, and also the stories in which we're able to tell. And from that country, there's different relationships that need to be followed and built. And so when visiting, and I've had the privilege in a music context to spend time with, I suppose, the international Indigenous music community, those relationships, based on what I'm taught about relationships here in the Aboriginal context of so-called Australia, those relationships within the international community become an obligation and become something, become an important part of the dreaming in which I have to live out in the national and international context. So those folks, particularly in those spaces, and particularly when working in global constructs, become at the forefront of process and processes. So a lot of the work that you mob are doing is so incredibly important in the international relationship building amongst Indigenous artists in the various art forms. And it's so vital, and it's so humbling and almost breathtaking to see so many folks taking part in conversations like this. Place is often the colonial place and the colonial construct of time, because we have to engage with those spaces often when we're working in production spaces and things like that. And where I am based here in so-called Brisbane, whilst I'm not a traditional owner of this place, this is the community in which I live and work. And so this is the community that I am most answerable to in an arts context, but also in the cultural context and the political context that is happening at this moment. Through obligation, we have responsibilities and we're accountable, and the inevitable advocacy, because I think, like elsewhere, the art sector in so-called Australia isn't where it needs to be to provide pathways for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders or visiting First Nations artists as well. Advocacy advocacy forms a vital part of the work, and a lot of the artists that might be visiting will have that role already existing in their spaces. You know, we don't get to just be artists, we have to consistently advocate for our space and for resources to be on our own lands, often even homelands, performing our arts practice that has existed since time immemorial. We are accountable to our communities, and that accountability extends to when we're visiting other lands. And so when we visit other lands, we are representative of the communities in which we are ancestrally connected to, and which we live and which we work. And so that is how we would carry ourselves in the spaces in which we're visiting other lands. And with that comes certain responsibilities. So where possible, the idea of being able to be perhaps across what the cultural protocols are of the lands in which we are visiting is really important, if that's possible, or meeting people where they're at, because we would follow those protocols to be respectful of who we are visiting, and that is the responsibility that we have on behalf of our nations. I might jump to the next slide. I've just popped in a couple of extra resources. We spoke briefly last time of the Australian Council for the Arts. There's a whole First Nations research list. In there is the Cultural Protocols Advice, which is really vital to the work that you're doing, but it is also very much a framework, and why we started with the map of so-called Australia with all the different language groups was to highlight why it needs to be a framework because of the differences that exist across all of us. There's another two resources that I think might be useful for the context in which you are from, and that's Another Day in the Colony by Chelsea Wodago. I'd recommend reading that book. It explains the Black experience and the Indigenous, so which is the same as the Indigenous experience here in so-called Australia. And I know there has been a really big international conversation online and elsewhere around the use of the word Black in relation to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, reclaiming Black in Australia by the Stoop, which was led by a Torres Strait Islander woman, who's someone I'm fortunate to know very well and learn a lot from, Rihanna Patrick. She spoke with Dr. Arnie Jackie Huggins, as well as Aurora Little Christie and Daniel Browning, around the term Black and how it is referred to here in so-called Australia, which I think is a really great listen, because it will set up the different international context of how that word, and therefore how Black deaths in custody, which is our version of the Black Lives Matter movement that's been happening since the 80s and even before that, exists in that context. And I think it's a nice, whilst it's a very deep cultural conversation and political conversation and race-based conversation, I think it's explained incredibly well, and it's a really good place to understand the way that term is used here in so-called Australia, but also BLAK, which is often a term that is used to delineate Blackness and Indigeneity in so-called Australia. So I believe we have some time for questions. I might get Andre to jump back in, or would you like to talk to your resources and then navigate the questions, and I'll see if I can get my mouse to work.
Yes, thank you so much, Alethea. A lot of the ground that I was going to cover earlier that I sort of skipped over is covered in quite some depth, actually, in the suggested resources. You can explore the timeline of sort of the context and that sort of thing of Native American self-determination. Again, Kanaka Maoli, Native Hawaiian, have their own story that is just as deep and rich. Overthrow of a monarchy, for instance, by the U.S. Marines, last I checked. There's just so much in there. And educating yourself about the history that actually is, because the history books in the U.S. don't actually really tell the story. They whitewash it. And so part of the work of decolonizing, part of the work of being a champion for equity, is educating yourself about what actually happened, that there were acts of genocide that happened against Indigenous people of many, many lands. And those were wrongs that countries have struggled with making right, to put it generously. These are some great ones. Native Land, again, is sort of the oft used app to find native land on Turtle Island. PBS did a lovely series if you want something easier to tackle. There's a playlist that I linked to. The U.S. Department of Justice actually has an Indian resources timeline, a timeline that enumerates all of the work, all the laws that were implemented in how they affected Native people. And then Native Philanthropy also has a resource as well. What else do we have? And then, does anyone have any questions? We are slightly over at this point in time. I do not see any. Also, please feel free to capture my contact information. I give half-hour free consults to anyone who asks. So I'm happy to dialogue with any of you. For those folk who are part of the Performing Arts Global Exchange Program, Alethea and myself are setting up a number of sessions where we can dialogue with you as well. So, all right. With that, I'm not seeing any additional questions. Thank you so much for coming in and with the intent that you brought to the table of finding more information on your pathway towards understanding. I wanted to thank Robin and Andrew at Mid-Atlantic Arts, my co-presenters, Ata and Alethea, who are amazing resources as well. Do you guys want to say anything in party?
I'll just jump in there and say ngā mihi nui, thank you to Mid-Atlantic Arts and to Alethea and Andre for having me here. As with my co-presenters, if anybody has any burning questions about anything Māori, my email address is there, and so feel free to drop me a message, and happy to answer questions and sort of guide you on your way if you need it. So yeah, and nothing is off the table. So any questions about anything to do with Māori culture, absolutely throw them my way. And if I can't answer it, I will definitely make sure to put you onto somebody that can. Kia ora.
I'll just echo what everyone has said. Please get in touch, and likewise, if I can't answer the question, I can put you in touch with someone who hopefully can. Big thanks to Mid-Atlantic Arts and co-presenters Andre and Ata. I thoroughly enjoy these sessions, and I'm not a morning person, of which it is right now, but it speaks to how wonderful it is to work in this space with you all. So thank you all for being here too.